It's my distinct honor, privilege to welcome and introduce our last two speakers, beginning with Professor Ammiel Alcalay of the CUNY Grad Center in Queens College. Ammiel is an acclaimed poet, translator, novelist, critic, and scholar. He's the author or co-author of over 30 books, including Islanders, Memories of Our Future. He's also, and of course, the foundational Before Jews and Arabs, Remaking Levantine Culture. He is also a noted translator, both individually and in collective. I'll just mention one translation of Faraj Bayraktar's Dove in Free Flight, which was co-edited and co-translated by the late Sharia Talagani, Allah yarhamah. And also, Ammiel is the co-translator, most recently, of a collection by the Gaza, Palestinian poet from Gaza, Nasser Abbas. Gaza, the poem Said Its Piece, hot off the presses, just arrived. And since we're speaking of presses that, although in this case are slightly less hot because of how long it took for the container ships to deliver at least my copy of the book, a massive compendium which sits on the table here entitled Controlled Demolition, which I am working my way through now presently, and I highly recommend. It's also my honor to introduce Professor Saree Makdisi, UCLA, where he is a professor of English and comparative literature. And his most recent book is entitled Tolerance is a Wasteland, Palestine and the Culture of Denial. I'm going to try to keep us to time reasonably well, which I think we've done okay. What I want to say is that when this panel ends, we're going to immediately continue into more or less an open discussion. I'm going to offer some concluding remarks, but I will be very brief, I promise. And we had hoped that this would be an occasion for us to have a more wide-ranging and open conversation about all of the issues that have been brought up today and anything else that you think we should talk about that hasn't been brought up, with an eye toward, as Zia asked before he went, about what kind of a theory of the future might we be coming up with here. So with that, I will hand things over, first of all, to Ammiel.
Now, Mike? Okay. I'm going to stand here and for a few minutes, and then I'm going to go sit down and talk from there. I wanted to start with a few poems, actually, just because I think, I mean, in a strange way, we haven't touched on, although everybody is thinking about it. You know, we have friends, and some of you may have family who we might not know if they're going to live through today. In the situation in Gaza and, you know, even in the West Bank. So I just wanted to put our thoughts there. And I want to read two poems, one that I translated myself by a young poet in Gaza who lives in Al-Maghazi, Saree Makdisi, who is actually Nasser's daughter. This is called The Bullet. The bullet goes right by you. In the wake of its echo, you count the wishes you're worn out waiting for. You absolve them and say, maybe there's more waiting to a lifetime. The bullet goes right by you, so you sketch string and a paper plane. A child's merciful fingers catch it, only to be spared by chance from the blood of the massacre. The bullet goes right by you. You sleep an hour longer. You dream. A rose grows in the depths of your veins, and light rain falls on the edges of the heart to make room for the poem. The bullet goes right by you. Shadow trees stretch out and doze off like your forgotten grief over there past the fence to the burial ground. The bullet goes right by you. A dove shakes the stars from its wings, casting peace upon your darkened way. The bullet goes right by you, and you smile for a lifetime of living, also delivered by accident and chance. And then I just want to read one poem from this new book, which is an older poem by Nasser Abach. These were co-translated with Khaled Al-Hili and Emnaz Ghal. And the book is just out, should be findable very soon. This is called Gaza, Gaza. The gifts I didn't send you on war's birthday, the poems waved to me as I closed the book like it was dying of gangrene, the bridges between my mouth and what I would say about anything shut down, the barracks next to the tall fence of my life, the time spent with old neighbors before they were scattered by the shell of absence, my dreams walking along with their old cane to a sea that couldn't care less, last pill in the cabinet of hope. The beads in my rosary are endless and I'm delirious. Gaza, Gaza. Like flags of a country that defeated itself from the heart to the heart, they came back staring into the void, looking for old addresses in the salty mail. As for the songs embroidered on the dress of sand, the heart flows like a river of purified regret, whirling like a sunflower, like a name dead to the lover, inventing doves. Back to the heart, they came back, stripped of their longing, nervous about how to open the suitcase of absence and let the snakes pour out. I'm delirious. Gaza, Gaza. So those are two poems. And then I want to open, I had a talk planned and I just spoke to Saree for a bit and I may turn on a dime and talk about something else, but we'll see. But I did want to start with this poem and I actually spent quite a bit of time watching the presentations from Toronto, and I feel almost like because I did spend that time with those things, that in a way I'm in dialogue with some of what was going on there. This is a poem of mine called My Apologies, and then I'll explain the circumstances of it. It's after Bulund al-Haidari, great Iraqi poet. To the hostages of our policies, my apologies. The petty stenographers of the crooked rulers in the once fancy, now crumbling cities of our fading empire lied then. They lied then and they lie now. Everything they say and write is a lie about law and freedom, about equality and justice, in the rubble of the bombs we make and sell, in the silent cries of limbless orphans, in the night lit by white phosphorus and the relentless sound of buzzing drones. They tell us we used to have things of value, even things we ourselves made, and that it was a place like no other. All I know is that Sinbad once sailed to Gaza, and so to Gaza he'll sail once more. So this is an homage to one of my favorite poems by Bulund al-Haidari, and I had the occasion to meet Bulund al-Haidari by chance. I was in London, and there was a memorial for Naji al-Ali that I was invited to, and so I met Bulund there. And when I introduced myself, I told him that I was a good friend of Nissim Rejwan, who lived in Jerusalem. And Nissim used to manage the Al-Rabita bookshop in Baghdad in the 1940s, where Bulund used to hang out. And so he was completely lit up, and he said, "Don't go anywhere. Stay afterwards. I want to write a letter to Nissim." So I waited. He wrote a letter. I ended up taking him to Nissim, and I want to just put that anecdote out there in relation to something that Max, actually, you asked Nasser Abu Rahme in Toronto about Arab Jews, and I want to say, I'm sure many of you, if you're familiar with my work at all, you're probably familiar with After Jews and Arabs, and I just want to say that's 35 years old, and I would think of what Said says in Ghassan Kanafani's Returning to Haifa, which is, under the dust, there's more dust. So I think there's no going back to anything. There is no going back to anything. We are starting in completely new conditions, even though those conditions have themselves been known for a long time. But they're now becoming more known and more extreme. So what I was thinking about, and I probably will not stick exactly to my plan, but in these situations, I'm always trying to find out where can any kind of leverage be found. And so I found myself thinking, what are some of the processes by which this Israel U.S. I consider Israel is simply this tip of the imperial spear of the U.S. I mean, I think that should be very clear. Um, and how did this relationship develop? And I, you know, somewhat trained in history amongst other disciplines, and but I think of history as also, you know, not necessarily official history. What are the, in a way, there's the Edward Said um, essay, Permission to Narrate, where he kind of is a pretty severe critique of Chomsky in a way, where he says it's just based on rationalism, and there's no as if that argument could be won. Now, that aside, there's another person, Peter Dale Scott, who some of you may know some of his work. Peter Dale Scott believed in a concept of deep politics, that there's, one needs to look at drugs, arms deals, undercover work, psychological operations, all of these kinds of things. And that's really, in a way, where I base how I think about what is actually happening. And so I wanted to run through some of that stuff, which I feel is very important. And yeah, let me do that. The exact quote there I was looking for from Kanafani is, "Beneath the dust of memories, more dust." But at the same time, in Blind Language, he says that one must have a devotion to what must not be destroyed. And I feel that as well about my own work, which, may someday have some leverage. I don't feel like it has it now, for a whole variety of reasons that maybe I'll see if I have time to get into. Okay, so where am I in all of this? In Journal of an Ordinary Grief, Mahmoud Darwish writes, "The place in which you are born is not always your homeland unless your birth takes place in the natural course of events within a historical community. If the birth is not part of a natural community, the place of birth is accidental." So, like many here, I'm sure, my birth is completely accidental. I could have been born in any one of 4 or 5 countries easily. And yet, I somehow find myself, quote unquote, American. So, given that, how to begin navigating these things? First of all, I think I'm not satisfied with the terminology that we use: settler colonialism, apartheid, even genocide. I don't think that these terms actually are descriptive enough, are localized enough, and they also present the danger of subjugating the subject in a variety of ways. And so I'm very attuned to trying to think of how we can create terminologies that are not subjugating, and that are drawn from the experience itself. So that's one thing. Another thing is, first of all, where do we find ourselves? And I think one of the best encapsulated descriptions I've seen of where we find ourselves is in a piece by Abdul Jawad Omar called "Shock Without Awe." And he ends it with this paragraph. "Today, Israel's hope is not that the world will soon forget this current phase of the conflict, nor does Israel seek to encourage the world to recognize itself in its carefully cultivated image as a lone liberal democracy holding back a sea of Arab and Muslim barbarians. Instead, it now hopes that the world will soon catch up with its stark monstrosity and cement its collusion in all the horrors that total victory might require." I think that is exactly correct. And I think that that what the people of Palestine are being subjected to, and of Gaza in particular, is a message to everybody. It's obviously a message to any kind of resistance, but it's a message to anybody who will not, in terms of a dying empire that is trying to consolidate what little power it has left. All it has really is firepower and economic chicanery. Um, so that's one thing. Another thing, in light of that, is, you know, really in many ways, the history of the 20th century can be seen in different forms of propaganda and different technologies of propaganda. So you start with the kind of classic, Bernays, Lippmann style propaganda. You move into the addition of radio, and then you get further technologized. You have IBM, relationship to the Third Reich. You have MK Ultra, mind control. I'll talk more about that later. You have television. You have the Phoenix program in Vietnam. You have human terrain systems in Iraq. You have Gaza as laboratory. You have the COVID surveillance lockdown regime, and you have Where's My Daddy, Lavender, and killing machines with AI. That's where you end up, and face recognition, and vacuum cleaning of social media so people can be incriminated for whatever. And that is meant as a regime over as many people as possible. I mean, clearly, these are questions of control. Now, finally, what is trying to be controlled? Okay, so Walid Daka says, he says the prison is a battle to control the mind, and he talks about it. Kaleem Hawa, in an article about Daka, calls shift in Zionist tactics away from targeting the prisoner's body towards the prisoner's mind, to turn the mind into the cell, targeting the full self in its psychic and spiritual totality. Okay, using different technologies. Now, obviously, in this last phase, the body has again become a target, but when Daka was writing this, that is what was happening. Now, this, of course, is classic, from the 1984 CIA Manual of Psychological Operations in guerrilla warfare. In effect, the human being must be considered as the priority objective in a political war. This concept of guerrilla warfare turns psychological operations into the factor that determines the results. The target then are the minds of the population, the entire population. Okay, so if we go to 1944 and what will become the CIA, the OSS. Many of the OSS people were trained at Fort Ontario in Canada, and even many of the people who became directors of the CIA, Colby and a whole bunch of other people, were trained there. I think Gottlieb, also the chemist, came from Fort Ontario. Anyways, this is they utilized and employed a lot of very smart people. So Gregory Bateson, for instance, who you may know from a variety of contexts, 1944 quote, "It is very important to sponsor spectatorship among the superiors and exhibitionism among the inferiors. Belonging then functions as a substitute for participation, and identity as a substitute for experience." Okay, so really the psychological operations that the U.S. Is quite adept in are very far-reaching and are very pervasive. Okay, and I want to take as just a small example is, and this may seem an odd transition, but the poet Ezra Pound in 1945, in May of 1945, is captured, kidnapped by people who were probably taking him for bounty, but he had been there had been a warrant put out for him, and he's transferred to a facility in Pisa, which is all African American prisoners who have, for one thing or another, have been in the brig, including Emmett Till's father, who Pound mentions in the Cantos. And by the way, interestingly enough, Frantz Fanon did not have a big library, his personal library, maybe 400 or 500 volumes, but he had the Cantos in there, which is very interesting. There's a list of his library in it. Anyways, so the Pound thing to me is very important, because the same week that Pound was captured and put in a completely disproportionate cage where his mind kind of snapped, was the same week that they began processing people like Reinhard Gehlen, who was the head of the Third Reich's, intelligence, whose main notoriety was being involved in the interrogation of Soviet prisoners and liquidation of them. But there were hundreds such people who really became the backbone of U.S. Cold War policy. So, we have to look at these things like quote unquote anti-Semitism and all of this whole business in light of the actual record of how the U.S. operated during the Cold War through, you probably have heard of Operation Paperclip, but there was credulity, apple pie, lithium, Ohio, dozens of them, dozens of these things, and they do then emerge in MK Ultra, which is a very pervasive thing. And I want to read, since we're at Princeton, I just want to read a wonderful quote by Alan Dulles, given at Princeton to an alumni group, which really forms the basis of the beginning of MK Ultra. In 1953, in a speech in April, he was then director of the CIA to the alumni of Princeton. I wonder whether we clearly perceive the magnitude of the problem, whether we realize how sinister the battle for men's minds has become. We might call it brain warfare. The target of this warfare is the minds of men, both on a collective and on an individual basis. And he goes on and, of course, accuses the Soviets of using brain-altering techniques, etc. 3 days later, he gave his authorization to the ultra-sensitive MK Ultra Research Project, whose objective was precisely to advance on the path to mind control. So, they introduced things like LSD, etc., and many, many different kinds of operations. Now, the reason I want to mention Dulles, and I'll cut to the chase a little bit, is that famously, John F. Kennedy had it out for Dulles and fired him. Okay, now, Kennedy's entrance into office on, I think 3 days before Inauguration Day, Lumumba was assassinated, which seems like a pretty clear message. But it's very interesting in that with the release of these Kennedy files, in a curious way, we've entered a time in which they don't matter anymore, which is very disturbing in all kinds of ways. Even though all kinds of things are coming up. And some of the things that are coming up are Kennedy being very adamant about nuclear nonproliferation. He got into very serious conflict with Ben-Gurion about the Israeli nuclear facility and his wish to have it inspected. He also, Adlai Stevenson in the UN during the Kennedy administration, talked about the right of return for Palestinians. Which is kind of shocking to even think about. And also the need for what becomes AIPAC to register as a foreign agent. Okay, and in fact, Sam Husseini, 2 days ago, posted something from the files, which was a letter from then Congressman Donald Rumsfeld taking Kennedy to task for objecting to, for wanting them to register. So these are institutional lines that run through policy that create what we mistakenly, I think, take to be partisan this or partisan that. There is U.S. policy that has shifted and moved in a variety of ways, and clearly from the time of Kennedy's assassination, LBJ becomes an enormous supporter of Israel. 1967, you have the Liberty incident. I'm sure everybody's heard about that, in which a U.S. Navy ship is bombarded by the Israelis, and they tried to kill everybody, but they didn't. There were some survivors, and those survivor veterans still have not gotten a reckoning about what happened in 1967. And at the same time, you have, you have COINTELPRO, which is just at the point when SNCC has declared itself against Zionism. You have this attempt to drive some kind of a wedge between the legacies of MLK and Malcolm X, okay, in the Black Power movement. And so you have, for instance, Mayor Kahane, who essentially is a CIA and FBI plant that is being run by COINTELPRO, and he's writing. There are these. I could read you one of these. It's pretty comical, but I'd probably skip it. I don't know. It's pretty good, actually. It's one of these. Okay, this is good. So he was then a writer for the Jewish press, believe it or not. Okay. So you had all these fabricated letters from, and I just want to mention, actually, I just want to mention that I was so happy when Joel mentioned Mikado Warshawski, who he and I were one of many of the first co-founders of the committee confronting the Iron Fist during the first Intifada, along with Faisal Husseini, Mahmoud Hawari, a bunch of other people. And there's a reason why I wanted to mention Mikado, because I had exactly that kind of reaction when I went to Israel for the first time. I looked around, I said, oh my God, I get it completely. Because I grew up in Boston. My high school years were 1969 to 1973. Boston was as segregated as the Deep South. At the same time, you didn't go to demonstrations, you went out of the house, and there were things happening during those years constantly. So I used to hang out every whatever day the Black Panther paper came out. I would go hang out with the guys who were selling it, talk to them. People would discuss articles. I would go to the Arlington Street Church and hang out and talk with people who were trying to go to Canada to dodge the draft. So when I arrived in Jerusalem, I looked around. I said, okay, I get this, and that was it. I didn't have any. It was pretty evident. So nice to hear about. So, anyways, this is from that world. Okay, so these are one of these fabricated letters. Here's a letter to Dear Rabbi Kahane. I am a Negro man who is 48 years old and served his country in the U.S. Army in World War II and worked as a truck driver with the famous Red Ball Express in General Eisenhower's, and of course there's a few misspellings here and there, to Army in France and Nazi, N-A-T-Z-I, Germany. One day I had a crash with a truck I was driving, a 2.5-ton truck, and was injured real bad. I was treated and helped by a Jewish Army doctor named Rothstein, who helped me get better again. Also, I was encouraged to remain in high school for 2 years by my favorite teacher, Mr. Katz. I've always thought Jewish people are good, and they've helped me all my life. That is why I become so upset about my oldest son, who is a Black Panther and very much against Jewish people. My oldest son just returned from Algiers in Africa, where he met a bunch of other Black Panthers from all over the world, et cetera, et cetera. You get the idea. So, this was a campaign being run by COINTELPRO to sow dissent and cause conflict. Okay, so let me see where I am here in this. Now, quite. Okay, so 1967. Okay, it's also what we're also seeing, which is very, very important. So economically, almost half of all Jewish families in 1965 had income in the nation's top 25% US, and the percentage of Jews in white-collar jobs was 3 times the national average, okay? And this is from Melanie McAllister's Epic Encounters. She says, the repositioning of Jews in American racial logic and the positive framing of Israel were intertwined constructs, just as the Nation of Islam and other Black nationalists were claiming Arabs as Black and masculine. Both Hollywood and Washington were representing Jews as white and masculine, okay? So what happens is, over the course of the late 60s, early 70s, you have what H. Bruce Franklin says is, over the course of the 1970s, Israel, or a certain image of Israel, came to function as a stage upon which the war in Vietnam was refought and this time won. Okay? And the reason why this took place is people, I don't think, know well enough the history of the enormous revolts that took place in the U.S. Army. Historically, it is one of the more uh, extraordinary situations where you had soldiers who killed their commanding officers because they didn't want to follow orders. They didn't want to follow the orders that they were being given. And I want to show you a brief clip here. It's 3 minutes, and I would imagine that a lot of you haven't seen this. Maybe some of you my age or older or a little younger, maybe so. I'm 69. But there's very little footage of this. This was an action called Dewey Canyon 3, which took place in Washington, D.C. I see Joel nodding, of course. Washington and some 800 veterans stood in 1971, stood in front of the White House and threw their medals at the White House. And it's extraordinary. Yeah, sure. Yeah, no problem. Time, what I wanted to demonstrate with this was the enormous distance we have gone from a public event like this to a series of, at the end of the war in Vietnam, 1975 to 1990, the wars are covert. 1990, the Gulf War, in which we have the opposite of what's happening now, which images were banished, no Highway 80, no, miles of incinerated Iraqis who were simply fleeing back to Basra, captured in an extraordinary painting by the great Iraqi artist Dia Azawi of a man, in rigor mortis coming out of his tank. And, and then we get to 9/11, and pretty soon after that, we get where we are, in which we have a completely different conception, with the end of the draft, and a professional army, and even, in the Iraq War, the multicultural army, which is still something that is being touted. The military it's not a military of the people. It's a military of the, of the oligarchs, of the ruling class, of the bankers, of the, of the politicians, of the donors, and of the geopolitical, situation. So I guess, what I wanted to bring this back before hopefully we get to this thing. The reason I mentioned Kennedy was also because I wanted to mention Mordechai Vanunu, the Israeli nuclear technician, who publicly exposed the known secret of Israel's nuclear power, which is something that coincided with the big prisoner exchange of 1985, in which many of the people who came to lead or who came to participate in the first Intifada were released. And one of the things that seldom gets talked about in any forums that I've seen, although Liron Moore did mention something very good, you have to keep in mind that a good portion of the Israeli population, that is the Mizrahi population who came from Arab countries, did not participate in the Nakba. They weren't there. Okay, they weren't there. So their Zionism, their inculcated Zionism through living now several generations in the state, is of a completely different nature than that of those whose predecessors came earlier. That's one thing. And at the same time, you have another phenomenon that I've noticed, which is that as the generation of people with real experience in the Arab world was dying out, more and more Palestinians were incarcerated. Okay, occupation got more brutal. Okay, and it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, and it has to do also with the class analysis of Israeli society, in which the Mizrahi population only step up the ladder occurred after the occupation of 1967. Okay, and that's something that's seldom even considered, talked about, taken into account at all. And I think it's very useful to think about those things. You know, it doesn't present anything particularly hopeful, but you have to analyze according to what actually happens. So that's something I wanted. Are we ready for this? Let's watch this thing, and then I think I'll probably be done. One more thing here is that in relation to what Professor Aziz was saying, I have had this wonderful idea of, and I think we could collaborate beautifully on this. This is Che Guevara. What a luminous near future would be visible to us if 2, 3, or many more Vietnams flourished throughout the world. And I was thinking about that. What about much more anti-Semitism? You know, not just anti-Semitism, but much more anti-Semitism. Old school type anti-Semitism, you know, that would really, you know, show what anti-Semitism might actually look like, as opposed to what they're trying to foist on us.
Thanks. There's the headline for the reporting on the conference.
This is an honorable discharge. It says, from the Armed Forces of the United States of America, this is to certify that Alan Wallace Morentz, Airman 2nd Class Regular Air Force, was honorably discharged from the United States Air Force on the 23rd day of May, December 66. Down at the bottom it says, this is an important record, safeguarded. For Skip Walsh, Sheriff of Sarasota, Florida, an Army Commendation Medal, and all my stuff.
Terry DeMont, Fort Lauderdale, Florida, Purple Heart, and CID. Ron Podlansky, Florida, New York, a lot of shit. Walt Kurtz, Tennessee, 4 Bronze Stars.
Right on.
I pray that time will forgive me and my brothers for what we did. And only those lumping pigs behind those closed doors have to suffer, and not the young kids and the unborn kids.
My name is Cruz Sanabria from New York, and I have a Vietnamese campaign ribbon, Vietnamese service ribbon, National Defense ribbon, and a Purple Heart.
Andrew Bobachek from New York. I have the Vietnamese ribbons and a Bronze Star.
My name is John Morrow, and here's a bunch of bullshit.
More bullshit!
My name's Peter Brannigan, and I got a Purple Heart here, and I hope I get another one fighting these motherfuckers.
Robert Jones, New York. I symbolically return all Vietnam medals and other service medals given me by the power structure that has genocidal policies against non-white peoples of the world.
Right on.
All power to the people. This is for the brothers and sisters of Kent. For the brothers and sisters this year. Second Battalion, 1st Marines. Power to the people.
22nd Cavalry's fighting Da Nang, and I hope they realize this is their last goddamn chance.
All up with respect for Army, retired. I'm taking in 9 Purple Hearts, Distinguished Service Cross, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Army Commendation, and a lot of other shit. This is for my brothers. Right on, right on.
We don't want to fight anymore, but if we have to fight again, it'll be to take these steps.
All right, this feels almost This is going to be a hard act to follow, so I'm sorry to be somewhat more conventional. But as I told Max, to whom we all owe a great deal of gratitude, and the organizers of the conference, I went through a number of changes in the past few weeks, especially as the situation in Gaza got worse and worse and worse all over again. I don't need to tell this audience, I'm sure, about the horrors that we are all witnessing every day, about the extermination of an entire population of over 2 million people, half of whom are children, which is unfolding before our very eyes as we watch. First thing I do when I wake up, last thing I do at night before I go to bed is check the news and see what's happening. And it's just like we're all living this nightmare that we can't seem to stop. So I didn't know what to do with this paper. So what happened was I was going to give a paper at one point, and then it just seemed like, what's the point? I don't know what the point is anymore of writing these kinds of things. And so I stopped that, and then I started writing about what's been going on here in the US the past 2 or 3 weeks, starting with Mahmoud Khalil and the repression we're witnessing all around us, of which the circumstances surrounding this conference. Is this thing coming and going? Let me try that one. So it seems like, yeah, that seemed pointless. I guess that's where I was with that thought. And then I wanted to write about what's happening right now, including the circumstances surrounding this very conference. And I ended up with neither one nor the other. So what you're going to get are two half papers rather than one whole, but maybe they form something. And the first half is the ending of the first version of the talk, which is really about what's been happening in Gaza seen in a wider kind of optic. So it's going to begin very abruptly. I'm sorry. That's just where it is. The question now is what peaceful and just resolution of the question of Palestine remains possible after all this death and destruction, especially given that it has been endorsed by the overwhelming majority of Jewish Israeli society on the assumption, extended to them by indulgent Western powers, that they will not be made to pay a price for it. The violence we witness in Gaza is paradigmatic rather than exceptional. In this sense, Gaza has revealed to the whole world in the starkest possible terms the meaning of Zionism. And it has in that sense also clarified where the question of Palestine stands. I pointed out in my book, Palestine Inside Out, that the Israeli occupation of Palestine saturates everyday life and must be understood at that level. Outsiders' attention is usually drawn during episodes of dramatic and large-scale violence, but the malign genius of the Israeli project is that it operates most efficiently through quotidian, routine, slow violence, drop by drop, checkpoint by checkpoint, home by home, permit by permit, family by family, demolition order by demolition order, which Palestinians have been enduring and resisting since their fateful encounter with the European colonial project of Zionism began decades ago. This slow, everyday violence is invisible to the outside world. It moves more slowly than the apocalyptic, fast-paced violence rained down on Gaza, but it still all adds up. If we zoom out from Gaza and look back over the same period since the genocide began, for instance, we'll find that, according to the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the Israeli state demolished 1,178 structures, homes, schools, livestock pens, whatever. 1,178 structures belonging to Palestinians in rural areas of the West Bank just in 2023, rendering 2,300 people homeless. It demolished 1,768 such structures in 2024, displacing another 4,000 people. It has demolished 296 structures, again, homes, schools, whatever, waterworks, and so forth. It has demolished 296 just in the first 2 months of 2025, leaving another 500 Palestinians homeless. And all this amounts to merely tiny specks in the vast field of ruin left behind by Zionism. For these numbers, incomplete as they are, address just the last 2 years, and only the rural areas of the West Bank, not the more densely populated cities such as Jenin, where the Israelis have bombed, bulldozed, and ravaged entire neighborhoods and deliberately churned up roads and water networks. In the past few weeks alone, Israel has forcibly removed 40,000 Palestinians from their homes in the northern West Bank cities, vowing that they will not be allowed to return. Meanwhile, and this is the point, the same state that destroys Palestinian homes has simultaneously been busily building new homes for Jewish settlers across the West Bank in contravention of international law. And this pattern, of course, extends beyond the West Bank. According to the Israeli human rights organization B'Tselem, the Israelis demolished 203 Palestinian family homes in East Jerusalem just in 2023, leaving 500 people, including 200 children, deliberately homeless. They demolished 209 homes in East Jerusalem in 2024. They've demolished 18 homes in East Jerusalem just so far this year alone. At the same time, of course, the state has accelerated its construction of settlements for Jews in East Jerusalem. In an advisory opinion published last July, the International Court of Justice found not only that Israel's entire settlement program in the West Bank and East Jerusalem is illegal and must be dismantled, but that, and I quote the World Court, the sustained abuse by Israel of its position as an occupying power through annexation and an assertion of permanent control in the occupied Palestinian territory, and its continued frustration of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination violates fundamental principles of international law and renders Israel's presence in the occupied Palestinian territory unlawful, unquote. But the pattern identified by the court, home demolition and the denial of rights for the members of one racial group, home construction and the affirmation of rights and privileges for those of another racial group, extends beyond the parts of Palestine occupied in 1967. If we look beyond the West Bank and East Jerusalem, we'll see the same pattern unfolding again and again. In the Naqab Desert in the south of Palestine, which the Israelis refer to as the Negev, thousands of Palestinians who are citizens of the Israeli state have been and still are subject to a process of home demolition explicitly intended to use the state's own language to Judaize that region. Looking back just over the past year or so, year and a half, and of course we could go back much further, Israel demolished the Palestinian community of al-Hiran in November 2024 to make room for a new Orthodox Jewish settlement to be called Dror. 400 Palestinians lost their homes in that process. In May 2024, the Israelis demolished the town of Wadi al-Khalil to make room for a road connecting the region's exclusively Jewish towns to one another. Unrecognized by the state, the indigenous Palestinian towns in the Naqab are not connected to road networks. The nearby town of Ras Jabra is due to be demolished by the Israelis to make room for the expansion of the nearby Jewish settlements of Dimona, and so on and on it goes. Just a few weeks ago, on 24 February 2025, the town of Araqib was demolished by the Israeli authorities for the 236th time. And you did not mishear me. They have demolished a Palestinian town, Araqib, 236 times since 2010, which is an expression of racial violence every bit as genocidal as Israel's by now ritual slaughter of whole families in Gaza. The Israeli government minister, Amichai Chichli, proudly boasted that he's overseen a 400% increase in the demolition of Palestinian homes in the Naqab. At least another 14 villages, home to 9,000 people, are at imminent risk of similar demolition. And just to make this point perfectly clear, these people in the Naqab whose homes Israel is demolishing to make room for new Jewish settlers are citizens of the state. They live within the state's pre-1967 outlines, not in the West Bank, not in Gaza. Placed in this context, then, we can see that the catastrophe in Gaza, for all its quantitative excess, is not qualitatively exceptional. It is, as I said earlier, paradigmatic of the larger Zionist project that is unfolding across every inch of Palestine and has been for 75 years. In fact, we must trace this project back to the Nakba that began but did not end with the great ethnic cleansing of Palestine by Zionist militias in 1948, during which at least 700,000 Palestinians were terrorized from their homes and hundreds of Palestinian villages were destroyed. Most of these ruins were later planted over by forests, intended to make them disappear into a new Europeanized landscape, as Israel shrilly announced to the world its plan to make the desert bloom. In a 2004 interview with the journalist Ari Shavit in Haaretz, the Israeli newspaper, the Israeli historian Benny Morris, one of the foremost chroniclers of the 1948 Nakba, argued, and I quote Benny Morris here, this is him, not me, There are circumstances in history that justify ethnic cleansing. A Jewish state, Morris points out, and again I'm quoting him, a Jewish state would not have come into being without the uprooting of 700,000 Palestinians. Therefore, it was necessary to uproot them. There was no choice but to expel that population. It was necessary to cleanse the hinterland and cleanse the border areas and cleanse the main roads. It was necessary to cleanse the villages. That's all that is not me, that's Benny Morris. That such violence would be necessary was noted by the very earliest Zionists to arrive in Palestine. Culturally, wrote Vladimir Jabotinsky in 1923, culturally, he said of the Palestinians, and I'm quoting him, they are 500 years behind us. Spiritually, they do not have our endurance or our strength of will. But, and again quoting Jabotinsky, they look upon Palestine with the same instinctive love and true fervor that any Aztec looked upon his Mexico or any Sioux looked upon his prairie. Recognizing who is the colonizer and who the colonized with a frankness that would make today's Zionists shudder, Jabotinsky was right, of course, about the Palestinians' attachment to their land, although clearly wrong about their steadfastness. Anyway, the same year that Benny Morris interview in Haaretz in 2004, a Jerusalem Post interviewer asked the Israeli government advisor, Professor Arnon Sofer of Haifa University, one of the architects of the Israeli isolation of Gaza that took effect in 2005 and set the stage for the ongoing genocide today. He was asked what the territory would look like once Gaza is cut off from the outside world. And he replied bluntly, and I'm quoting Arnon Sofer here, when 2.5 million people live in a closed-off Gaza, it's going to be a human catastrophe. Those people will become even bigger animals than they are today, with the aid of an insane fundamentalist Islam. The pressure on the border is going to be awful. It's going to be terrible. So if we want to remain alive, we will have to kill and kill and kill all day, every day, unquote. Now, there's only one worry that Sofer has with this killing, which, by the way, he says is the necessary outcome of a policy that he is helping to devise. So he's doing this knowing that it will involve killing. The only thing that concerns me, he says, and I quote him again, is how to ensure that the boys and men who are going to have to do the killing will be able to return home to their families and be normal human beings, unquote. But the point of all this, to quote him one more time, is not just killing for the sake of killing, and I quote him one last time. Unilateral separation doesn't guarantee peace. It guarantees a Zionist Jewish state with an overwhelming majority of Jews, unquote. Now those words, of course, were spoken, as I said, 21 years ago, but the killing started long before that. It's continued long afterwards, and it will continue as far into the future as anyone can see, for as long as the project to maintain an exclusive state in what has throughout its history always been an inclusive land continues. Since 1948, after all, the Zionist project in Palestine has been engaged in the killing of Palestinians and the destruction and demolition of Palestinian homes wherever it finds them, on both sides of the 1949 to 67 armistice line, separating what's called Israel from what's called the occupied territories. That is the thread tying together the towns, villages, urban communities pulverized in the Nakba to the villages of the Naqab, to the Palestinian communities in the West Bank and East Jerusalem, to finally Rafah, Jabalia, Beit Hanun, and Gaza City. In order to clear and secure an exclusively Jewish national space in a land that has never in its history been exclusively Jewish, or exclusively anything else for that matter, Zionism has always involved, and will always involve, the destruction of Palestinian homes, the smashing of Palestinian lives, the obliteration of Palestinian rights. As both Morris and Sofer make irrefutably clear from their own unapologetically Zionist perspective, the Zionist project in Palestine has always required and will always require violence. To support Zionism is therefore, and you can take, this is not me, you can take Jabotinsky, I just quoted them for you, Jabotinsky, Sofer, Morris, there's plenty more where they came from. Take their words on this, not mine. To support Zionism is necessarily to support endless violence against Palestinian communities, violence that, as Israeli public discourse and opinion polls during the Gaza genocide document in the starkest possible terms, has the blessing and endorsement of the overwhelming majority, 94% according to Tel Aviv University polls conducted during the genocide, of Jewish Israeli society. This support is not an index of either the mental or the moral health of Jewish Israeli society, however. It is evidence of the colonial nature of that society, which, like every colonial society before it, is structured by a logic of violent permissiveness. Return to the long and bloody history of Western colonialism out of which it emerged, there is in fact nothing remotely interesting, unusual, or exceptional about Israeli society. Its values and endorsements express the logic of a colonial culture that pre-exists it, gave birth to it, and sustains it to this day, rather than of strongly opinionated or individually unpleasant or racist people. Zionism was launched as other settler colonial projects are being wound down. Palestine was colonized as the great process of decolonization began sweeping Asia and Africa. The Zionist project in Palestine is and has always been an anachronism. It is out of place and out of time. An end to the violence in Palestine fundamentally requires dismantling the entire regime of settler colonial apartheid that began when the first Zionists forced the first Palestinians from their homes in 1948 and will continue until Zionism itself is abandoned as an enterprise and Palestine, a land for all of its people, Muslims, Christians, and Jews, is free. Well, that's one part. The second part is about what's happening here now. And these are, I think you'll see, two sides of the same coin. And I have to say that a lot of what was said before me today, I'm just going to echo because I can't but echo it. With the nation aghast at the footage of vulnerable students of color being abducted in broad daylight by the masked gunmen of ICE, far too many people have fallen into the trap of thinking of the current government crackdown on our college campuses as a replay of the McCarthy repression of the 1950s, or even perhaps as a symptom of outright fascism unleashed by Donald Trump. Such an assessment, it seems to me, misses the point. The Red Scare overseen by McCarthy was intended, or so people were told, to protect America from the threat of communist infiltration. Fascist governments abuse power in order to maintain their own grip on it. The campaign of brute intimidation ravaging campuses across the country, however, is not meant to deepen Trump's grip on power or to safeguard the American government or political system. It is rather intended to protect a distant foreign country and to shield it from criticism here in the country whose taxpayers increasingly unwillingly finance its system of apartheid and its program of genocidal violence. After all, not one of the students being pursued or detained today is accused of criticizing the US or its system of government. What they are alleged to share in common, rather, is their criticism of Israel's genocide in Gaza and their advocacy of universally acknowledged Palestinian rights. Even now, in this gathering darkness, you can stand with a bullhorn in the middle of any American college campus, including this one, and say what you want about Donald Trump or the American government, and nothing will happen to you. Criticize Israel, however, and you run the risk of receiving the same treatment as Mahmoud Khalil or those other students or faculty members across the country, including people in this room, who have been doxxed, lost jobs, been fired, expelled, or suspended, had degrees revoked, faced threats, lost funding, been declared persona non grata at their own institutions, fled the country, or gone into hiding. The surest evidence of this isn't just in the roster of those chased or abducted by ICE so far, every one of them supposedly in connection with the anti-genocide protests at campuses last spring, but also in the ransom list presented by the Trump government to Columbia in order for the university's $400 million in suspended federal funding to be restored. Every single item on that list represents a long-standing demand, not of the MAGA right, but rather of the institutions or individuals who have for years been lobbying and cajoling Columbia, like other universities across the country, in order to suppress the criticism of Zionism and Israeli policy and stifle the advocacy of Palestinian rights on our campuses. Chief among these demands is, we heard about this earlier today, is the forcible adoption of an illegitimate, abusive, and thoroughly discredited redefinition of the very concept of anti-Semitism. By mendaciously seeking to conflate Judaism and Zionism, this redefined anti-Semitism aims to classify criticism of Zionism and of the Zionist state's policies as a form of anti-Jewish hate speech, and therefore to banish it from classes, readings, textbooks, assignments, conferences, and so on across the United States. This redefinition of anti-Semitism has been promoted for years by the ADL, AIPAC, American Jewish Congress, Hillel, and other constituent elements of the Zionist lobby. Only under the threat of government sanction is it finally being imposed on institutions including Columbia and Harvard. Others will surely follow. Some, such as NYU, already have. What Zionist lobbying groups, donors, regents, or trustees have been unable to accomplish through the conventional methods of enticement, complaint, or emotional blackmail, they are finally able to accomplish through their direct influence over the government of the United States, which has in turn willingly allowed itself to be co-opted, not to protect the interests of the United States, but rather to protect those of the Zionist project in Palestine. What we're witnessing is thus not the return of McCarthyism, but rather something entirely unprecedented, as far as I know, in the annals of history. Plenty of governments have repressed free speech or academic freedom to protect themselves from criticism and dissent. But never before, as far as I know, has a government repressed its citizens' free speech and academic freedom in order to protect an entirely different country. Never before have the rights of the citizens of a major metropolitan power been abrogated or its leading institutions thrown into crisis and disorder in order to safeguard the illegitimate and criminal policies of an insignificant state thousands of miles away. Trump and his circle may want to go after the critics of American power as well, and they may yet do so, but they haven't yet. And even if they decided to, there's no readily available list of their campus critics for them to go after because, as far as I know, no group or institution has compiled such a list in the first place, if only because such practices are seen as fundamentally incompatible with the norms of a liberal democratic society. Zionist organizations and individuals, on the other hand, have been assembling and maintaining digital blacklists since the very dawn of the internet. Academic colleagues get used to it, warns the Zionist agitator Martin Kramer, and I quote Kramer here. Yes, you are being watched. Those obscure articles in campus newspapers are now available on the internet, and they will be harvested. Your syllabi, which you've also posted, will be scrutinized. Your websites will be visited late at night. Kramer wrote those words not last week or last month, but over 2 decades ago in 2004, although it's taken till now for his words to finally bear their dark fruit. The reason why Mahmoud Khalil, Badr Khan Suri, Rumeysa Öztürk, Mamadou Taal, and so many others have been the ones who have been hunted down, rounded up, deported, or forced into flight, then is because they are among the thousands of students, faculty, postdocs, researchers, and others whose names have appeared on one or another of the many blacklists assembled and maintained by the army of Zionist organizations that have been besieging our campuses since the 1990s with the sole intent of suppressing criticism of Zionism and of Israeli policy. As I said before, no other political movement or faction, to my knowledge, maintains similar blacklists. Campus Watch was one of the pioneers of this surveillance and blacklisting effort in the 1990s, with watch lists focused not on individual professors only, but also on whole campuses. David Horowitz has generated one blacklist after another, depending on who's funding him at any given time. Canary Mission's crude character assassinations of pro-Palestinian students and professors joined the party in the 2000s. During the Palestine Solidarity protests last year, Zionist organizations hired Horowitz-style vans to drive around campuses emblazoned with the names and pictures of students protesting against the genocide in Gaza. The latest edition, of course, is Beitar, the local manifestation of a Zionist faction which was founded by Jabotinsky himself back in the 1920s, an organization so nakedly hateful that even the ADL feels obliged to distance itself from it. Beitar, as you know, has been boasting openly that Mahmoud Khalil was on the list it provided to Columbia University and the Trump government, and it's got many more thousands of people on its lists. Long before the current crackdown on our campuses began, the ADL had been promoting an effort to charge students demonstrating for Palestinian rights on American college campuses with material support for terrorism, which would lead not simply to misdemeanor charges or administrative punishments, but to criminal prosecution on far more serious terrorism or conspiracy charges. As Maura Finkelstein explained to us this morning, the Heritage Foundation's Project Esther's invocation of a fictional Hamas support network helps to solidify this same tendency. When we see the Trump government accusing students who have been protesting against genocide with sympathy for Hamas, or pledging to investigate the supposed terrorist roots of student protesters, then we can recognize the payoff of years of diligent campaigning and lobbying for exactly this equation of support for universally recognized Palestinian rights with terrorism. Newspapers like the LA Times, the New York Times have sustained the narrative of campus anti-Semitism, meanwhile, by insistently telling us that Jewish students in quotations, say they feel unsafe on our campuses. Which Jewish students, though? Jewish students do not constitute one mindless mass with the same political orientation necessarily aligned with a foreign country, as Haraziz was just reminding us. They are a collective of autonomous individuals with a wide range of moral, ethical, and political stances, and more of whom are resolutely committed to the advocacy of Palestinian rights, including the Jewish students who have just chained themselves to the gates of Columbia University just this past few days. It's certainly true that the Jewish students most in danger on our campuses are the ones protesting against the genocide. They've been shot at with rubber bullets, attacked by off-campus mobs, arrested by the police, subjected to legal and administrative prosecution and harassment, and run the risk of suspension, expulsion, or the retroactive loss of degrees they'd already received, something which I didn't even know was possible until Columbia started doing that recently. The rights, feelings, and interests of these Jewish students, however, simply do not register in the campus anti-Semitism narrative that Trump and his company use to justify their crackdown. This narrative was initially propagated not by Trump, who presumably couldn't care less about anti-Semitism, and not only by cynical right-wing politicians like Stefanik, whose concern for genuine anti-Jewish prejudice is at best doubtful, given that many have accused her of it herself, but by plenty of liberal Zionists last year. Surveying this grim scene of repression, censorship, and outright punishment gripping campuses across the country, it's tempting to reflect on the enduring institutional power of Zionism in the US. In reality, however, what we're witnessing reveals the extent of Zionism's weakness. 30 or 40 years ago, Zionism was entrenched and hegemonic in American higher education. Its power was expressed precisely in the extent to which it could simply be taken for granted. It didn't need coercive enforcement mechanisms. As new academic histories laid bare one after another of the myths surrounding Israel's creation, and as Israel's own behavior became more and more nakedly racist, and its violence increasingly abhorrent, beginning actually in 1982, I would say, hence the June Jordan connection is very important there, and of course nowhere more obviously than in the present genocide, Zionism started to lose its grip on our campuses and really among young Americans, including young Jewish Americans in general. The current repression is a belated attempt to restore the status of Zionism on our campuses by trying to eliminate the possibility of critique or even argument. As the wreckage of Columbia shows, however, the cost of this restoration is the destruction of the university itself. Zionism can reclaim its hegemonic status, in other words, only by destroying the very institutions it wants to save for itself. That is not a sign of strength. It is yet one more indicator of Zionism's terminal decline. Thank you.
So much, Saree. Thank you, Ammiel. I think the best thing to do, given the time we have left, we were in this room till 6:30. We can probably stay a little bit after if there's interest. I'd like just to offer some concluding remarks and then open things up for conversation for as long as it lasts. Questions for Ammiel, for Saree. I can moderate it. So let me try to offer this by way of conclusion. I hope and I do now believe that this conference created space for us to have, by turns, a rigorous, a scholarly, and at times very personal conversations about anti-Zionism in myriad forms, and the creation and protection of this space for discussion, debate, and dissent, as Saree so powerfully just reminded us, can no longer be taken for granted and must be fought for. And I want to take inspiration from Asmat, my co-organizer and friend who can't be with us, but as he mentioned in his remarks and as he discusses to great effect in his forthcoming book, the conference form itself is a meaningful unit of knowledge production. It's also a multivalent site for political, scholarly, and social analysis. And in the last few weeks running up to this conference, I've been reflecting on an ironic fact that there was another conference on the topic of anti-Zionism that was proposed but then scuttled in that fateful year of 1982. The conference was not proposed by radical academics, but by the information department of the World Zionist Organization, under the title Anti-Zionism, a Threat to Democracy, ? And it was envisioned to be held in conjunction with the World Zionist Congress in Paris. Now, those organizers who I refer to as anti-Zionists, some of you have heard me speaking at length about this recently. I hope more of you will hear about it as I get these ideas better formulated through those conversations. Those anti-Zionist organizers had been mobilized in part, and in large measure, I would even say, in response to the November 10th, 1975 UN General Assembly Resolution 3379 that labeled Zionism a form of racism or racial discrimination. Their conference was canceled following the intercession of the CRIF, the leading communal Jewish organization representing French Jews, as well as, in tandem, the World Jewish Congress and the State of Israel itself. The two public reasons given for the cancellation of the conference were, first, that the CRIF was opposed to changing the focus of that year's World Congress from the problem, the very real problem of what was then called anti-Semitism, as opposed to the problem of anti-Zionism. Second, the ruling Likud party's leadership feared that the conference would provide an opportunity to criticize the Israeli government at a time when Israel was bogged down in its Lebanon war and facing major reputational issues. So a campaign emerged, a campaign that I refer to as anti-Zionism, to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism, increasingly referred to from the early 1970s as the new anti-Semitism. And, as importantly, to convince the world that anti-Zionism now represented the greatest threat to the Jewish people and the state of Israel. Opposition to the 1982 conference went as high as the Prime Minister, Menachem Begin. It was argued by representatives of the World Jewish Congress and the State of Israel that the World Zionist Organization, what I would call the mothership, or at least the core of the anti-Zionist movement, would not be able to muster the credibility necessary to defend Zionism and the State of Israel on the world stage against those charges of racism, so long as Israel was practicing apartheid in the occupied Palestinian territories, referred to in their internal debates, letters that are available in the Central Zionist Archive and have been celebrated by one of the leading anti-Zionists, Yochanan Manor, deputy director of the World Zionist Organization's information department. They referred to this as Israel's Palestinian policy, and so long as Israel's violent adventurism in Lebanon was ongoing and subjected to increasing international opprobrium, which was of course exacerbated later that year by the massacres at Sabra and Shatila. Now, many of you will know the history of this. In pursuit of Palestinian resistance fighters who had been ensconced in Lebanon after being forced to flee Jordan after the Civil War of Black September, 1970, Israel invaded and occupied southern Lebanon in 1978 and made their way to Beirut in 1982. Eli Eyal, a revolutionary anti-Zionist in my estimation, headed the information section of the World Zionist Organization at that time. And he, these internal personal letters and correspondences show, was misled by Prime Minister Begin, as well as Eyal's own boss at the World Zionist Organization, Ari Dozin, as well as the donors and the leadership of the World Jewish Congress itself, as they all came together to work against Eyal and his deputy Yochanan Manor's gambit in order to keep the focus instead on the question of anti-Semitism, specifically not anti-Zionism as it was wished. And in the end, Eyal and Manor's initiative was reduced to a special session at the Zionist Congress. But, I argue, the dream of an anti-Zionist counterinsurgency had been born, first to target Resolution 3379 and eventually succeed in having it repealed in December of 1991, but then to transcend that initial mission and to continue to pursue the kind of information warfare that Ammiel referenced in a different context a few minutes ago. Since the campaign against Zionism is racism, anti-Zionism has continued in its efforts to demonize, delegitimize, and apply a double standard to anti-Zionists and to anti-Zionism. Some of you may recognize that language from Natan Sharansky's famous 3Ds, which I am repurposing for my own ends. One of the pieces that came out of the many World Zionist Organization-sponsored conferences that followed was a piece by Israeli political scientist Ehud Sprinzak entitled Anti-Zionism from Delegitimization to Dehumanization, which was published in 1984, and which Yochanan Manor referred to as the manifesto of their movement. And just for fun, and because I take inspiration from Ammiel, I brought some show and tell, which is a pamphlet, which you can't see, reads The Threat of Anti-Zionism, and it is one of the pamphlets that was ultimately published following the series of workshops that followed the failed attempt to take over the World Zionist Congress. Whatever the case, we now live in the world that the anti-Zionists made, and because I'm taking the liberty of being in an executive capacity here, I will just plug the argument that anti-Zionism is a counterinsurgent form of knowledge production that is part and parcel of a larger ideological, political, and military campaign against those who are critical of Zionism and or the state of Israel. Importantly, not only, or not even especially, in the land of Israel-Palestine, or even the greater Middle East, but internationally. And as we are seeing now at universities and other institutions, primarily in North America and Western Europe, but also elsewhere, interestingly, simply speaking about anti-Zionism in a conference setting or elsewhere is now perceived, portrayed, and apprehended as a threat to, yes, Jewish safety, to public order, and in some of its most hysterical forms, the foundations of civilization itself. So before closing, thank you for your indulgence, there is another conference that I wanted to briefly mention as a, for me, a more inspiring model that was also organized in the early 1980s on related themes, but with a very different rationale. On May 6th and 7th, 1983, a symposium on the subject of Judaism or Zionism, What Difference for the Middle East, was convened in Washington, D.C. by two organizations: the International Organization for the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, AFERD, and American Jewish Alternatives to Zionism, AJAZ. AFERD, for those who do not know, was founded as an independent, non-governmental organization dedicated to promoting and upholding the 1963 International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, which was, as many of you will know, the foundation for the 1965 UN Declaration, and in many ways the inspiration for the 1975 Resolution on Zionism as Racism. So founded in 1976 in response to the controversy around 3379, AFERD investigates racism as it relates to the Israel-Palestine conflict, South Africa, and the conditions of indigenous peoples around the world. AJAZ was founded by Rabbi Elmer Berger, a successor to and an outgrowth of his American Council for Judaism, a Reform Jewish organization. Now, admittedly, this is a relatively obscure conference organized by two organizations that have been marginalized, maligned, and mostly forgotten. But I find it instructive to think about and with how those two conferences in 1982 and 83 represent two very different approaches to the questions we've been discussing here. One makes of anti-Zionism an enemy to be eliminated, while the other thinks Zionism and anti-Zionism alike in relation to questions of religion, history, solidarity, and social justice. The second conference entailed a non- or anti-Zionist Jewish organization working together with an international anti-racist one in order to think critically about what Zionism and anti-Zionism meant in relation to Judaism, and crucially, not only for Jews to do so, but for the entire world, really. And this should recall to us, I think, the need to think outside of the oppressive ideological conditions within which we must now struggle together. So the joint efforts of those two organizations seem to me to embody the kind of radical academic, intellectual, and political possibility, hope this conference somehow continues to pursue, and that the research agenda that Asmat and I have begun will enable. I hope that these efforts, to put the point as clearly as possible, will help us to arrive at an intersectional anti-racism, which for our purposes must mean a politics of anti-Semitism that is also fundamentally, implacably, and unapologetically anti-racist, making it anti-Zionist. Thank you. The floor is open.
Mike?
Thank you so much. So in the comment and question that I made in the last panel, you kind of could gather my anti-statist biases, but now I have an anti-university bias question, an anti-university bias question, which is, okay, the world is breaking, but the world breaking is also a moment of possibility and openness. And so in some ways, the attacks on the universities that we've seen in the US at least have exposed the influence of trustees and financiers and hedge funds and also wings of the American government that you don't really think should be involved in decisions about what's on your syllabus. And so what are the ways in which this moment of crisis could also be leveraged and seized by people who want to return or to try to build an actually democratic university? And how can folks in elite universities in particular try to create that space rather than leaving it for the folks at CUNY and in community colleges and people who have been at the really sharp end of this for quite some time?
We're both involved in public situations, so I have no clue. I don't go to those places. I don't step into them. I have no idea. You know, like, this is the first time I've been in a place like this in a very long time. So I really don't know what to tell you. I mean, I don't, how can I put it? Obviously, I am very pro-student, and I didn't think that in my lifetime I would see the kinds of things that we've seen on US campuses and around the world in terms of Palestine. But in terms of how a university operates, okay, there's a wonderful book that nobody reads, Christopher Simpson's book on psychological warfare. Okay, 1950 figures for the late 50s, 94% of funding for the social sciences in US universities came from the military. And, you know, we know which places these are. These are the big research places, and this is where this stuff happens. That's, you know, it's not like France where they have dedicated, you know, places that do that work. It's like every county in the friggin' country makes some widget that goes onto a bomb or a plane, you know. So that's how it works, and it's the same with the big universities. So your question is great. I think I also believe that there is some opening here, that people might be able to see what kind of structures they inhabit, and that it might lead to some, you know, some actions or initiatives that would either, you know, force certain things to happen in those universities or withdraw from them and create those structures elsewhere. You know, I think it is a very fertile moment in many ways. So thanks for that.
Yeah, I concur. It's not only a great question, but it's a very important question, and all of us should be thinking about it. Again, as somebody who teaches at a public institution, I can't offer you a defense of private universities. That's not I'm not gonna do that. I think it's important to have all kinds of spaces, though. But I think it's important, no matter how critical we are of all of these institutions, including the public ones. I mean, I teach at UCLA, you know, which is a role model for the repression of its own students and faculty right now. We still need we need spaces where we can actually think and write and cooperate and teach and so on and so forth. And so I would still argue that we need to defend them until we find some alternative to them. But the ones that most urgently need defense at this point are the public places rather than the private places, because the private places actually have resources to fall back on if worse comes. I mean, Harvard has an endowment that's like the GDP of a middle-sized country, right? So it's, in a way, it doesn't really need ongoing support from the state. But I would just say that's what we need to hang on to while we figure out what's going on. But I'd also think that means it's a political project, right? Especially, that's why I'm saying public university is so important. And because of that, it needs to be connected to a broader political project of transforming or reclaiming our democracy, which is we're already off a cliff. We're accelerating down off. We've already gone off. We're just tumbling down. We're in the physics building. Isn't there something called the what's it called? The physical concept, the final acceleration you get to? Terminal velocity. That's what it is. That's what we're looking for now, right? So we need to connect these two things together, and that's kind of what I was trying to get at in that scrambled way by saying what happens in the political system, what happens in campus systems are two sides of the same coin. We need to reclaim them, because right now we're very much on the defensive, and that's not a good position to be in.
Besides the obvious targets here, the political targets, I think the main aim here eventually is going to be to tax the endowments of the big universities, which I actually think would be fine, and they can give us some money, CUNY and Rutgers, yeah. No, I know they won't be giving.
Let's take a few questions and allow this to become a conversation. So I think Sahar was up, and then bounce around a little bit. You guys.
Thank you for your presentations. I'm trying to think about the future and how to be less reactive. And I'm curious to know what the value is of focusing more on knowledge production from the perspective of Palestinians. I mean, it's not uncoincidental that in Columbia they're trying to destroy the Middle East Studies Department and the centers and the Institute for Palestine Studies, et cetera, et cetera. I thought that was quite transparent. But do you see any way to build, whether it's within, I'm going to say within universities, in ways that can just produce knowledge that brings forth more perspectives of Palestinians? Because I've been trying to understand what happened that caused so many college students who do not have a personal connection to Israel or Palestine to go to these protests and these encampments. And there are a lot of different theories, and there's a lot of causal factors. But I think one is the exposure to the knowledge production of the Palestinian perspective. And it's certainly not sufficient, but I'm just curious to know what you think of that. Is that even worth the investment of time and money, or is that too reactive? And of course, this is a long-term, suggestion or question.
Yeah, go ahead, Raz.
I'm also thinking about this question that was raised earlier about the future, but I have a few thoughts. I mean, in terms of universities today, public or private, I mean, the situation seems very terrible, right? And it seems very hopeless, actually, in very many ways, in terms of the power that we're facing, right? And in that sense, I mean, in terms of thinking about knowledge production, or just the insistence, like Max, as you said, to insist to have the space, right? At this moment, I'm thinking about Polish universities, actually. Okay, World War II, and then so Nazi occupation, right? Then Stalinism, communist oppression. Just recently, also, right? The Law and Order. I mean, they were defeated and destroyed. Professors, students were killed, sent to concentration camps. They went underground. They created flying universities, right? They insisted on continuing to teach, and with no hope, right? At some point, in some points in this history, there was like no one could envision, right? What would happen. But they're still there, Polish universities today, and in some sense, they're not bad at all. The University of Warsaw just created a new LGBTQI program in Warsaw, right? So there's a way to think about the future that is not rooted actually in any kind of, that is rooted in the insistence on to do what we need to do in a university, right? It's in some cases in all costs, right? In any condition, as long as we can do it, until we are interned, killed, whatever, or fleeing. So that's one thing that I was thinking about. I did want to say that I'm thinking about, Saree, what you said about like the foreign country, Israel. But if we think about Project Esther that you mentioned, Mara, before, they're like, the anti-Semitism is anti-Israel, anti-Zionist, and anti-American, right? And the thing is that it's not, I don't really think that it's about, it's about the fact that now we see clearly that what's happening in Gaza is Israeli settler colonialism taken to its logical conclusion, right? The Greater Israel Project, maximum territory, minimum Palestinians, right? If we come to terms with that, right, then it's settler colonialism, and it's settler colonialism here. That's where it becomes anti-American, where it touches the core of what really the US is, much more than about its actually foreign policy. It's about what the US was always, and it still is. I'm thinking about the Dakota pipeline ruling now against Greenpeace, right? And I'm thinking how these things are connected very much to an American identity. Yeah, so I had a that was a question to you. And finally, again, thinking about the future, I mean, there was a mention of a dying empire in relation, I think, to the U.S. And I'm wondering, how do we actually see the empire, dying? In what way do we see it? What we see now is an incredibly powerful empire, actually, right? I think. On the other hand, if we think about that other place, right, Israel, right, then we do see that Gaza has now, if we talk about the soldiers and officers from Gaza, we know that there are tens of thousands of these killers who are suffering from what killers in any case of mass atrocities are suffering, right? A mental breakdown. We know that the mental services in Israel have also broken down, so they're not receiving any treatment. We in other words, we see a society in Israel that is breaking down. This could take a long time, of course, this process of breaking down, right? But I'm wondering about the dying empire here. So there's all kinds of things that we can say about the dying empire there, right? But I'm not sure about the dying empire here, which again raises these questions of what do we do, right, with a situation that is, I think, very American.
So, should I go? So first I want to endorse what Raz said about universities. All we can do is what we can do, and what we do, and we need to keep on doing it with every ounce of energy to our dying breath. So I'm struck by what seems to me to be a very stark difference between what Ammiel said and what Saree said. Ammiel spoke, what is the point of this genocide that we have been witnessing daily to our great horror and pain? And Ammiel spoke about it in two different ways. One is that it's a demonstration effect, that its purpose is to show people what will happen to you if you resist. And of course, Israel is intending that to mean what will happen if you resist the state of Israel. But as Roz just suggested, and Peter Beinart has spoken eloquently about this as well, the reason that people became hysterical in the United States when people began to talk about Israel as settler colonialism is because as soon as you say that, oh, wait, we have that here too, don't we? And so, in that sense, the Heritage Foundation's approach to the question is spot on. If you are engaging in a sharp, full-on critique of the Zionist settler colonial project, its racism, its expropriation of Palestinian land, and so on and so forth, all those stories that we know very well, too well, implication is we have a problem here as well. Ammiel also spoke about the particular status that, no, Raz spoke about this earlier, and also Ammiel, to connect. The particular status that elevating anti-Semitism and the Holocaust after World War II had in obscuring the crimes of the West. And it's for that reason, I think, that you find lots of people who aren't Jewish, aren't Christian Zionists, just regular folk, thinking that there is something special and inviolable about the state of Israel and all of its political and cultural claims that amount to both political and emotional blackmail. Saree emphasized what seems to be an incredible amount of power that a bunch of rich Zionists can mobilize to crush universities and ultimately many other institutions. And clearly that's real. I mean, I certainly would not maintain that power is not what it appears to be. We're seeing it in its full nakedness. But these are two very different ways of thinking about things. And I think that I'm not positive about how to round out this analysis, but it seems to me that it's the simultaneous strength and weakness of the American empire that leaves an opening for the kinds of operations that Saree spoke about to happen, which wouldn't happen in any normal, healthy society.
Let's let one more question go if you don't mind. Ooh. Let's just, since he's been waiting to, they've been waiting to.
Hi, thank you both. The sort of origin point of my question was similar to the point that's already been made by a couple people about sort of how we read the specific targeting of people who've been involved in the Palestine movement, who've been kidnapped in the past few weeks, and sort of the dialectical poles, I guess, of reading that as being specifically about Israel as a foreign power versus kind of what it signifies about the U.S. as declining empire. And the thing that I would add to it that actually both of your talks made me think about is where the Cold War and kind of the long contested meaning of the Cold War comes into that. And I mean, something that you said, Professor Makdisi, actually jumped out at me, which is that, you know, that the Cold War was a kind of at least ostensibly about the fight against the spread of communism. And of course, the ostensibly, carries a lot of weight because of the way that, as we know, the Cold War was also used to target so many different kinds of people on the basis of both identity and different kinds of political activity. And part of why I'm so curious about this is because it seems to me that, and I think this actually goes to something that Sahar was saying, like that part of what's been so striking about the movement in the past couple of years is that it has drawn together people on, I guess broadly the left, but from so many different kind of political stripes. And I can imagine how, among the many reasons that the Trump administration might be targeting Palestine activists specifically right now, one could be like that's where you find everyone else that you want to target. And I wonder if that is also a way of gearing up for there to be other sites. Maybe like the next round will be saying that people are endangering the police or what have you, right? So I guess, yeah, in this kind of more like, I don't know what you want to call it, universalist poll or something, of what all this signifies. Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering what both of you make of this and kind of where the Cold War history fits in, especially given the fact that like another Cold War is being geared up for.
I'll just briefly try to cover some of those. Just you got to think a little bit geopolitically. Okay, this country has got roughly probably 40 trillion in debt. Okay, it's unsustainable. Okay, they're most working Americans are living from paycheck to paycheck. If they have a health crisis, they're either dead or they're in debt for a very long time, or they're going to lose whatever they have. Okay, so that's what I mean by the dying empire. I mean, this is not the kinds of power that is being wielded, and the role of Israel is not. We have to stop thinking about Israel as an independent entity. I mean, it's very clear that if the U.S. wants Israel to do something, they're going to do it overnight. If they say this is the way you do it, there's no funding for this and no more arms, and that's it. That's very obvious. So what we're seeing is like a new Sykes-Picot. I mean, half of Syria is being occupied. Lebanon is continually decimated on a daily level. And Israel is positioning itself to restructure the whole. Look back a little bit. The regime change in Libya, the destruction of Iraq, the destabilization of all kinds of places, the rise of the Gulf states, the Saudis playing a central role. Why did they have the Ukraine? Why were those negotiations in Saudi Arabia? It's insane. I mean, what does that have to do with anything? Everything is being reconfigured. Everything is being reconfigured and financialized in different ways. And Israel is playing an enormous role in all of that. And so while all of this stuff is going on that we're looking at in these minute ways, the world is changing like really fast. And this is all in relation to, China's alliances with Russia and BRICS and the possibility of the US dropping out as the reserve currency and all of these kinds of issues, which are going to rapidly change the cost, the standard of living in this country. So all of that stuff is happening simultaneously. So I think, a lot is being thrown at us. And I think it's really worthwhile to see these smaller battles that are taking place, which are very crucial for people involved in them, are part of this bigger picture. They are very much part of this bigger picture. And if we think through it that way, we might find ways to leverage differently.
Those are amazing questions. There's no way we could possibly do justice to them, but I'm looking forward to the dinner where we can, but I'll take a stab at some of the things that came up because I think they're important. I don't know, Ammiel and I might disagree about something, which is okay, because we can have drinks afterwards. Which is the relationship between the U.S. and Israel. I have never bought the line that Israel is an extension of American policy. I think, if anything, it's almost the other way around, which is to say, I don't think Israel, you could say maybe during the Cold War, it might have served some function for the American empire, maybe. And even then, that's like after 1967, because before 1967, it was the British and the French, not the Americans. Like all of Israel's tanks and jets and so forth were British and French. They weren't American until after 67. The Liberty, the USS Liberty, the attack on a US Navy ship, which went on for 14 hours, it involved napalm, the torpedoing of the ship, killing 33 US Navy crewmen, injuring 150 something of them. When the crew realized the ship had these huge holes in it from the torpedoes, they were going to abandon ship. They put their lifeboats in the water, and Israeli torpedo gunboats shot up the lifeboats so that nobody would survive if the ship actually sank. That happened, and the U.S. didn't do anything about it. Whereas, as we know, the Gulf of Tonkin, an attack that didn't take place, was used to justify American intervention in Vietnam, further American intervention in Vietnam. That just says something, there's something here that doesn't make sense. And I think we need to think about the significance of the USS Liberty. We need to think about the significance of the fact that when the invasion of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait and then the American alliance against Iraq took place in 1990, 1991, if Israel had been an outpost of American power, that would have been the time to activate the outpost. And exactly the contrary happened. The Americans told the Israelis, don't say anything, don't get involved, shut up, go away, you ruin everything if you get involved. And since then, the Americans have had, as we know, massive military infrastructure and installations all over the Arab world, especially in the Gulf, right? Huge ports and air bases and army bases. They don't need the Israelis. When Iran attacked Israel last spring, the Israelis couldn't defend themselves. They needed the Americans to defend them for them, and the British and the French too. It's like, what is this attack dog that when it's attacked, you have to help it? That's not what an attack dog is supposed to do. It's supposed to do the work for you. So I've never bought this idea that Israel serves American interests, which is why there is the formidable lobbying apparatus that we see, and what's happening on our campuses, I think, is part of that lobbying apparatus. That's why when we look at the institutions that Maura was talking about, Maura was talking about Hillel and so forth, but there are the Israel on Campus Coalition. It's 38 separate organizations. Hillel and Stand With Us and Birthright, blah, blah, blah. They're all part of that, but there's like 38 of them. Why do there need to be 38 organizations representing the interests of a foreign country besieging our universities? Like, there aren't British versions of that, or French ones, or German ones, or Canadian ones, because they don't need them, right? And again, to me, the British relationship with America is so instructive. That America and Britain have an organic, I mean, it's social and historical, blah, 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 but you know what I mean? Like, it's an organic historical relationship. So when they go to war together, the British don't need to coerce the Americans to come to war. That's not how it works. So I just see in this, the Israel-American relationship is much more, I think it's much more artificial. I think it's the product of coercion and lobbying rather than of America's own actual interest, which is why we can see our institutions, they're imploding. I mean, like, look at Columbia, look at Columbia especially, but Harvard, and God knows what's coming down the pike too, right? So our civil organization, civil society is on the brink of crisis, not because of what's happening here, but rather because of the meddling of this foreign country. To me, that's mind-boggling. As I said, as somebody who works primarily on the British Empire in the 18th and 19th centuries, there is no equivalent of some little province of India ordering things to happen in London, or ordering the repression of British citizens in London. That was unthinkable. Or Ireland doing the same thing. So that's what I think. About the empire, first of all, on both the Israelis and the Americans, I'm much less. It's true that they have an incredible capacity for destruction, both, right? And they can blow up. We're seeing it happen every day. They're bombing and killing and destroying and shooting and so forth. But that doesn't mean they're going to be able to attain their objectives. The Americans have been bombing Yemen now consistently for about 2 weeks. We read just the other day, they're beginning to run out of bombs. And the Yemenis, like, the Red Sea is still closed. I mean, that's Yemen, which went through its own genocide and 10 years of war and starvation and siege. They've basically told the Americans to go fly a kite. And the Americans are bombing the hell out of them, and like nothing's happening. I mean, they're killing people, but that doesn't mean Yemen is going to change, right? The Red Sea is still closed to international commerce because of Yemen, of all countries in the entire world. That's like what? So what is the same thing with the Israelis in Gaza? Yes, they're exterminating people now, clearly, but they did that for a year and a half, and they still weren't able to hold an inch of Gaza. Everywhere they were being attacked every single day. If they go back in now, Netanyahu says, we're going to take over, we're going to do this, we're going to have a new thing. If they have soldiers on the ground, those soldiers will be attacked every single day. And the Israeli army, people here know more about this than I do, I'm sure, in this room. It's not meant to sustain 2 years of active military confrontation. It's a reserve and conscript army. It's not built to do it. They're going to run out of soldiers. It's already fraying and falling apart. And you know this much more than I do. Internally, there's all kinds of internal cracks that are coming up. So I don't know. Like the ability to destroy and kill does not translate into the attainment of political objectives. And so what we're seeing is destruction and killing, but it's not actually it's not attaining anything, right? So I don't know. That's my sense. About the empire here, I would say, yeah, I mean, Trump is clearly a symptom of America's terminal decline. We have to remember, Ammiel mentioned it, the debt, I don't think it's 40, but it's $36 trillion. I mean, it's a staggering debt. And the US is, the rest of the world are America's creditors. They can call in the debt if they want to, right? They may not want to, that may not serve their purposes because they'll lose their money. But what brought about the end of the British Empire was Britain's debt to America. That's what killed the British Empire finally, fatally, after the World Wars especially. So America is in debt to the rest of the world. What Trump announced, do you know the tariffs that do you know what logic he was using? He was basically saying, if we have a balance of payments deficit, we consider that a tariff. I mean, it's like it's lunacy what he's doing. And it's not going to help America. It's certainly not going to help restore America, make America great. So I think the university's gone off a cliff, we're going off a cliff, the whole country's going off a cliff. I don't see it as a great power. I think it's thrashing around trying to reconnect to something that isn't there anymore. So that's my sense. And then one last thing about the university. I think what's this attack on our institutions, what it's trying to do is to put a genie back in the bottle, and the genie's not going back in the bottle. Because the audience for it is the younger generation of students and young Americans, including young Jewish Americans in general. And they were already turning before Gaza happened. Now that this has happened, they're not going to go back. I mean, we can burn these places to the ground, and young Americans have decided, by and large, what position they're going to take. So I think what they're trying to do is futile in that sense. I don't see power as potent as it thinks that it is. It's destructive, but destruction doesn't do anything in and of itself. I still think we should fight for these institutions. I mean, as I said in response to the first question, I think the fact that they're so focused on them tells us that's why we need to defend them too, because otherwise they wouldn't be bothering. Well, why are they passing all of these measures to try and crush all of our university spaces? There's clearly something good about these spaces. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother with them. That they are tells us we need to defend them, I think. And so I'm committed to that. It sounds like a conservative move, right, in response to the first question. But I think we do need these spaces. Like we're entering, I think, in the US, something like the Middle Ages, the equivalent of the Middle Ages, where monasteries were these centers where they held on to ideas for 1,000 years until the world was ready for them again. I think that's kind of what we're talking about here at this point, too.
Just a quick addition to, I actually agree with everything you said in another way, okay? It's like you can have both things, hold many things in mind at the same time. The two quick things I would say, which you alluded to, okay, I think that the resistance of Hamas and Hezbollah, I think scared the hell out of I mean, they are not, these are small fighting units without an air force, without a navy, without artillery, without tanks. It's unbelievable what kinds of, how they held the greatest military force on earth, which is the UK, the US, and Israel combined. and a bunch of other people throwing in weapons and technology and intelligence. So that is extraordinary, and that, I think, put the big alarm on, and that they need to show absolute, pure destruction, total destruction, and no recourse to any kind of negotiations of any kind. That's pretty clear. Because again, just in terms of the geopolitics, I think that the Israel is a Jewish state, with a Arab minority, serves the U.S. very well, because they don't want any states in that region to be actually democratic, to be actually equitable, to be maybe socialist, that's finished. That has been the war, from the Cold War on, to take over, to put all those countries within the American sphere. Because of the resources, that's very clear. So Israel serves a tremendous purpose in that, in its all the things that it stands for. Yeah.
All right, I'm going to borrow Saree's physics metaphor to try to do a creative segue out of here from terminal velocity to escape velocity. And I want to thank you all so much for being here, for making it all the way through to the end of a grueling day. Thank you so much for helping us make this space, protect the space, preserve the space, and we'll fight for the monastery university for as long as we can. Thank you all so much.